Hi, everybody. This is Agnes from No Sediment, and welcome to our No Sediment Podcast. Today we have a guest that I think for a wine world doesn't really need an introduction, but I will introduce him still. So Andrew Jefford is columnist for Decanter and the World of Fine Wine magazine, as well as academic advisor to the Wine Scholar Guild. And one of your recent books is Drinking with the Valkyries.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but this is one of the many books you have.
Yes, so 12 or 13 altogether.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Impressive. Yeah. So welcome. How was the flight?
It's great to be with you, Agnes. The flight was, I'm happy to say, very trouble-free. So
okay.
Great to be here in Riga again.
So the reason why you're here, and I was incredibly lucky to be able to get an interview with you, like I'm not sure that it would be that easy otherwise, is because Riga Wine Champagne, together with Igersnorts, is organizing the wine competition, the Wine of the Year. And this is your third year, if I'm not mistaken here?
Third year in a row, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you right away that kind of, it might be aggressive question. Why did you agree to come to Riga, Latvia, this very small country that not necessarily makes or is famous with wine?
Well, it's a beautiful place to visit. I don't know the Baltic countries very well. I've never had a chance to travel there, so to come here was a great opportunity. And then once, actually, I first came here, I think 2012, 2013, I did some presentation masterclass for Igars back then. And I discovered actually that Latvia has a really lively wine culture and a long and intricate wine culture too. Historically. So I discovered there was lots of wine interest here. I made wine friendships, and as you know, wine friendships are very good friendships, and they last a long time. And so now I had the chance to come here for Wine of the Year competition and judge. Always a pleasure. It's really a great opportunity. It's a highlight of my year.
Oh, wow, that's so nice to hear that. Yeah. So I actually would like to talk a little bit more about this wine judging or wine blind tasting. So what we do here in Riga Wine Champagne, we taste all the wines blind.
Yeah.
And it's normal, I guess, completely fine that you have your preferences in wine taste. You know, when we go outside and in the restaurant, we order the wines that we enjoy, and for everyone else as well. But in these wine competitions, we are supposed to put that subjectivity away and kind of in front with the objectivity. So how do you keep that?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and there's a number of things to say. First of all, I think for those of us, for the audience watching this interview, we should say that blind tasting in wine is never quite the same thing as blind testing in scientific terms. In other words, we always know something about the wine. We know where they come from, not who's produced them, not the vintage, not the price, not any of that retail information. But we do have some idea about where the wines come from, which is actually very important because wine is a cultural object, and you need to, perhaps we'll talk about this a bit later, you need to be appreciative of that cultural object and its cultural background in order to make the most of it. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that objectivity, subjectivity, as far as wine are concerned, they're two filters. Objectivity is, I would say, a coarse filter. In other words, anybody can be objective about a wine in terms of anyone with a little experience can be objective about a wine in terms of dividing them up into bad wine, boring wine, good wine, or very good wine. But then in the end, you have the fine filter, which is subjectivity. And when you have a whole set of good wines, as we hope we will when we get around to discussing gold medals, for example, then you really have to fall back on your subjectivity. And that's really how you nuance between various sorts of really good wine. I don't think you can do that objectively because in the end, we're all authentic drinkers. And this is very important for tasting too. And I think this is not often said enough. What is a wine taster? A wine taster is a surrogate drinker. We are tasting on behalf of all the people who are out there drinking. Those people out there drinking want to know what's a really good wine of this particular type. And this is something that's actually, I always emphasize this with Decanter World Wine Awards, which I'm co-chair of in London every year, the world's biggest wine competition. When you taste in these competitions, it's very important to taste each category as an enthusiast, because those categories are going to be bought by people who are enthusiastic about those categories. In other words, it's very important not to be a policeman. It's very important not to be an examiner. You need to be as objective as you can be up until that final stage where you have to be subjective. But you also need to be enthusiastic about the category in question, because otherwise you won't appreciate everything that it's got to offer, which is a very important part of judging, actually. The final thing perhaps to say about judging is, it's really important to have as wide a palette as possible. Now, you made the distinction when you asked the question about we all have our own preferences, and it's quite true, we do. If you go to my cellar at home, you will see, the same wines cropping up again and again and again. But when I come to judge, I have to make my palette absolutely as wide as possible, because there may be categories that I personally don't like very much that I have to judge fairly on behalf of all those people who are enthusiastic for that category. So that's why I would also stress, when you judge wines, you need to keep a very wide palette if you can.
It sounds to me that it is, for you, maybe more of a philosophical, almost like a question to keep the palette wide, rather than I will judge it and look for a specific criteria. Does this wine have a long enough aftertaste? Does it have balance between alcohol and tannin or fruit?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting you're saying all those things, because what you're presenting me with really is a sort of, let's say, the WSET or the Master of Wine approach to tasting wine, analytical approach.
Yeah.
Which is great for the purpose in the Master of Wine exam to sort of come up with some logical, sensible answers about the wines you're tasting blind, to show to your examiners that you're a proficient student and you've learned enough about wine to be able to differentiate. But that's not what we're doing when we're doing Wine of the Year competition. There we're surrogate drinkers. We're working on behalf of these people who love these wines to find the best examples of those wines. So, yes, if you want to call it philosophical, yes, I'm perfectly happy with that term.
Well, maybe my English is not correct.
No, but actually I love philosophical approaches to things, so it suits me down to the ground. But what I would say is it's rooted very much, and this is something I try to come back to as often as I can, in the experience of drinking wine. The actual real experience of all the people out there who are sitting down on a Friday night with their friends. They want to have a lovely time. Wine is going to be a part of that lovely time. They want to make it the best part they can. That's what I mean about the experience of drinking wine, which is completely different from the analytical tasting process. So I would say that for something like Wine of the Year competition or Decanter World Wine Awards, it's important, to be analytical to a certain extent. That's the sort of playing the objectivity card. But also, you can take that too far, and you need to be appreciative. You need to remember the experience that people have when they drink wine is not an analytical experience particularly. It's an appreciative experience. Perhaps we could say there are two different ways of tasting wine. There's analytical and there's appreciative. And, when we judge wines in Wine of the Year competition, we should do both, actually, not just stick with the analytical, but also remember to be appreciative.
Yeah, I agree. As I mentioned at the beginning, so we do taste these wines blind. But what I found very interesting is I read a book by S.C. Evelyn on champagne, or it was another article, I don't remember. But anyway, she was talking about Jacques Salot's champagne.
Yeah.
And she specifically said that this champagne should never be tasted blind in any kind of competition setting, because it just loses the context. And she also said that actually we tend to judge that quite famous, quite expensive champagne very low. So what is your thoughts on this? It kind of then become I think it is an interesting question or approach that some specific wines are not good in the blind tasting, even though we do appreciate them a lot.
Yeah. Well, in general, I would say that both blind tasting and sighted tasting, as it's usually called when you know what it is you're tasting, have a very important role to play. I am a great believer in blind tasting, and in some ways I think wine critics, if I dare say, don't do enough blind tasting. Wine critics are very worried about blind tasting because they might taste a famous wine and not like it very much, and then they would feel, I don't know, embarrassed or guilty or whatever. But actually, to me, I do a lot of blind tasting for World of Fine Wine magazine and for Decanter magazine, various other things too. And it's very important because it's a sort of acid test. You confront the naked wine to some extent. Actually, it's not completely naked because you know roughly where it comes from and so on and so forth. But it's you and the naked wine. And it's very important to sort of trust your judgment under those circumstances. And that, by the way, is the way in which you discover new things, really great new things, or growers who are trying hard who aren't particularly famous yet or anything like that, things like that. So I think it's a very important sorting process. However, I think what Essie is saying also has merit, because as I said at the start of this conversation, wine is a cultural object, and famous wines. Why are they famous? Why is the first growth in Bordeaux? Well, it's because people have been looking at those wines for 300 years, in Burgundy for 1,000 years, every year, year after year, comparing, tasting, and thousands and thousands of palates have done this. I mean, famous wine critics are a very new invention. Mostly it was people who loved wine in the past. And over the course of all these repeated tastings, these things have been found to be repeatedly very satisfying, very beautiful, very lovely. So that's what I mean about the cultural wealth that lies behind a wine. It comes from a place, it has a history. People have repeatedly looked at those wines in context of their peers and found those particular wines to be beautiful or memorable or glorious or age-worthy or many of the other wine qualities that people have. Well, that is important too. So I would never say all wine tasting should be blind tasting, but I would never also say all wine tasting should be sighted tasting. I think both play a very useful role, actually. They're complementary.
They're complementary.
Yeah.
All right. But if we kind of circle back to that beginning when we talked about the analytical tasting, which I'm more familiar with, currently at least. So one of the ways, and actually also in the judging rooms, we often discuss the typicity of the wine, the typicity of the grape, typicity of the area or terroir, if you will, winemaking. And now with the climate change, and not necessarily also, with generation change, like the typicity might also change. How do you look on this issue? Like if you see the wine is coming from a Chablis, let's say, like a very famous terroir, and it not necessarily shows a typical flavors or style of Chablis, but it's still a great wine. Do you tend to maybe score it down? Or?
Yeah. Okay, so let's just repeat your definition that you've given there. So just in case people don't understand this term typicity. So typicity, most wine tasters have some experience of different sorts of wine. And so when they come to a wine, they have, let's say, a sort of platonic ideal of how that wine should be. They have a sort of idea in their minds of the perfect example of Chablis. You gave that example. Sancerre, another famous wine. Napa Cabernet, whatever it is. We all have some sort of idea about what a really great wine of that sort should be. So that would be typicity. I'm a bit ambiguous about typicity. I'm not a huge fan of typicity, and I'll tell you why. Because typicity can often be used prescriptively. And I've come across this a lot in the French wine world, where there's a lot of rules and regulations and bureaucrats and people, getting involved in giving approvals for things and all the rest. And typicity is often a criterion there, but it's used to push things out or push things away. And again, this is something we might talk about later, but for me, the most important thing in wine actually is not excellence, which I believe to be a rather difficult and fallible concept, but it's difference. To me, the great joy of wine is difference. So the moment you become too strict about typicity, the moment you become too prescriptive about typicity, you begin to exclude difference. You begin, if you like, to taste like a policeman or an examiner. You're saying, okay, I've looked at this wine. it's not bad, but it's not completely typical. And you'd say, okay, I mark it down because of that. To me, that is a dangerous process, actually. I mentioned a little earlier that, when we're doing tasting of the sort we're going to do this week, you need to keep as wide a palate as possible. I love difference in wine. So yes, a perfectly classic Chablis is a great pleasure. But there might also be another Chablis that isn't perfectly classical that could also be a great pleasure. And I'm looking for pleasure. I'm a surrogate drinker. I'm looking for pleasure. So I don't want to exclude that other sort of Chablis that might have a very different sort of pleasure that isn't typical. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about typicity, and I try not to use it as a criterion. You can say, is this wine a bad wine? Is this wine unpleasant to drink? But that's a different question. That's really back to our basic objectivity. Bad, boring, good, very good. But when I'm looking at good or very good wines, honestly, I'm not saying the more typical the better. Definitely not.
I like that.
I'm just looking for pleasure. As a surrogate drinker, I'm looking for drinking pleasure. That's how I'm going forward.
May I just tell you this one thing before we continue? It actually kind of fits into that typicity quite beautifully. We were just recently traveling to Bordeaux with car, and we stopped in Sancerre, and I bought a producer, which I believe is beautiful producer, François Cotat.
Yeah.
So
good example.
So we bought that wine, and we arrived at Bordeaux, and I put that wine in the fridge. I just wanted to have that high acidity, freshness, something that I expect from Sancerre. So I poured that wine in the glass. It's the only wine cold, and I try it. And my first impression, I was disappointed because it was not what I expected.
Yeah.
But then,
yeah,
I just kept coming back to that glass because that wine was absolutely beautiful.
I couldn't have made a better example of what we're talking about than the one you've just given us. So it's amazing that you just happened to buy that wine on that trip. But I was almost looking for examples. That would be a perfect example to choose.
Yeah.
Now, because he is harvesting much riper actually than many people will in Sancerre, and he has some fantastic sites, low yields, all the rest. We could also, talk if you want to talk a little bit further about it, about Olivier Zimthumbrecht in Alsace. Olivier's, for many years, things have changed now, but his viticulture was so good that he couldn't make completely dry Alsace wine. It was just not possible. Now he's changed the way he does things, so he does make more and more dry wines. But, those wines, which was typical? Is the dry typical? Is the less succulent, the rich typical? I don't know. They're both beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm looking for pleasure. I'm behind them both.
We were discussing with Tim Wildman, Master of Wine. Hi, Tim. About the typicity and terroir. And he said, and he asked me, may I ask you this, or send you the question, what is, in your view, the difference between typicity and terroir?
Well, to me, they're completely different things. Again, we defined typicity a little bit earlier. Let's now define terroir. Terroir is the sense of place in a wine, which has many origins. It has physical origins in the actual particularities of the physical place on earth, the soil, but also the climate and the weather in the season, everything, the topography, the way the landscape lies, all of those things, super complex. Million elements to that already. But then it's also the great variety, because you have to select a variety for a place in order that the distinguished place should best express itself. And then also you have to relate it to the human activity of creating wine in that place. So it's the sense of place you get from a wine with all of those three elements feeding into that sense of place. So it is an enormously complex equation. And I should also say that it's not necessarily very forceful. I always think a good analogy for the sense of place in a wine, terroir if you like, is the watermark in a banknote, for example. You hold the banknote up to the light, you can see the watermark in it. It's not something that shouts at you as you look at the banknote, because the banknote is printed. but it has this watermark in the paper. And that's almost the way in which you get the sense of terroir inside a wine. So that's something, and for me, it's actually the most precious quality of a wine of all, because I said to you a little bit earlier, I prize difference as being the highest wine quality. And of course, terroir is intimately related to those differences. It's not the only way in which you create difference, but it's a very, very significant, and it's certainly the most interesting way in which you create difference in wine. Whereas typicity is a sort of certain set of expectations about a wine that we bring to a wine from our own wine culture, but to me they're completely different things, and in fact they don't necessarily have to overlap at all. So, yeah.
Slightly controversial question. Is there sense of terroir or sense of place in the François Cotat Sancerre wines?
Absolutely. Yeah, because, you get the best sense of terroir when people are most faithful to the origins of place in the wine, when they've worked so hard in the vineyard in particular to harvest the best possible grapes. We know from 1,500 years of tradition, 1,000 years of tradition, 500 years of tradition, I'm not sure how long it is that Sauvignon Blanc has been planted in that place, but we know it is the best variety for bringing out the sense of place. So you grow the best possible grapes you can. You make a decision about perfect ripeness. Love to have a discussion with you about perfect ripeness, because that's a super interesting topic.
That's true.
And then you take it off to the winery and you make the wine in the most simple way you can, without a lot of new oak, without adding anything or taking anything away, altering the chemical balance of the wine, without a lot of physical intervention on the wine. Also, I would say without a lot of ideological baggage about how the wine should be made. You're just simply trying to translate everything you've created in the vineyard into a wine in the bottle. That's what he does. And so, yeah, to me, that is terroir. I'm not saying it's the only way in which, there would be other interpretations of terroir, because that's where the human element's so important. Humans, it doesn't exist without humans. I mean, all terroir is just silent potential without humans. The whole of Burgundy was once a giant forest until humans came along and cleared the forest and planted vines. So terroir only comes into being with that human input. And of course, the moment you have human input, you have the potential for doing things in a different way. And I'm not saying the François Cotat wine is the only way of doing it, but it's a very sincere, and as you discovered with that bottle, very beautiful way of doing it. So yes, to me, that is terroir.
I want to order more of that wine. That was something absolutely amazing. So
yeah, you're making me salivate already. Yeah. I'm looking for a glass.
Yeah, we will arrange that.
Yeah.
So the next question actually is more about the wine vocabulary. Again, coming from a world currently, at least, where we have very strict vocabulary that we are using. And we are increasingly now talking about should we maybe elevate it or maybe add some new terms, or, because, for example, what we discussed this week in the symposium is that so many descriptors of the wine that is so maybe common for us might not necessarily be common to other, groups of society, cultures. And so should the wine vocabulary change? Should it be more inclusive? What's your view on that? I mean, Your wine vocabulary is wide as it can get. I read the book. I was, underlining.
Well, okay. First thing to say perhaps is that there's certain sets of vocabulary for certain purposes. Okay, so, you're a Master of Wine student. What the Master of Wine examiners are looking for when you write your tasting paper is a certain thing. That's not necessarily what the people who are going out looking for that beautiful bottle of wine with their friends on Friday night are looking for. They're looking for something else. And mainly, I am writing for the Friday night people. I'm not involved in Master of Wine. I'm not a Master of Wine. I'm not a Master of Wine student. So I'm not actually too involved in that whole academic approach to wine tasting language, albeit for the Wine Scholar Guild, it's something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment. And indeed, Julien Camus, who runs the Wine Scholar Guild, is working on a tasting program in which he's trying to work towards a different set of language to be used about wine. That will be launched in the next 2 or 3 years. So watch the space in that sense. But anyway, for me, the most important thing is communication. And communication with as many people as possible in a way that will communicate as vividly as possible. So for me, actually, what I lament with most wine tasting vocabulary and wine descriptions is a lack of imagination. I'm a great believer in imagination. Almost every field I've ever worked in, I've always lamented the lack of imagination in the people, in my bosses. I still think that none of us ever use our imaginations enough. Imagination is a wonderful tool. We could be using it much, much more extensively than we do. And I would include, wine tasting in that. Because, the standard wine tasting terms relies very heavily on what we call descriptors in the wine world. In other words, analogies or metaphors. And in, a lot of wine tasting notes, these things pile up. They're about 3 feet deep, meter and a half deep. Piles and piles of these words, and they don't mean anything. Maybe 1 or 2 of them would, but by the time you throw 32 of them together, they don't mean anything anymore. It's just noise. It's just verbiage. So to me, when I really want to describe a wine, I would try and work, very slowly towards building a single metaphor about wine, about a particular wine, to try and convey what I feel about it. And I would look as widely as possible. I wouldn't just look for descriptors or metaphors or analogies. There's also textures. You can draw analogies from many different worlds. I believe the Chinese have a phrase, taste wine just like person. In other words, talk about wines as you would talk about people. I think that's a very good idea. I'm all behind that. I'm behind anything that can communicate in a sort of unhysterical but carefully developed way. I think you also have to, when you write tasting notes, you should think about the rules of good writing. One of the, in English, there's one of the things that people will learn not to do when they're writing is mix metaphors. That's a classic writing fault, if you like. To me, classic wine tasting notes are just nothing but mixed metaphors. So, I think a lot of them need to start again from scratch. Really, you need to work to build a much more imaginative framework about creating wine tasting notes. All of that said, I know it's very easy for me to sit here and say that, and when I do the 1 bottle column for World of Fine Wine magazine, I can take 2 or 3 days just talking about one wine. Of course, if you're a wine critic tasting the 2022 Bordeaux's, you have, 300, 350 wine tasting notes to write. You haven't got a lot of time to sort of sit and craft a beautiful note about every one. So then you're going to fall back on your your fundamental communicative abilities. It's quite telling, actually, that you can always tell who's written a particular note amongst well-known note writers. Parker was very distinctive, for example. Hugely enthusiastic, used to grab terms from anywhere. On literary terms, they weren't very good notes at all, but somehow the enthusiasm always burned through. And I think that's why his notes communicated very well. Now I think we have so many more critics, and to me a lot of the languages are rather homogenous. I don't know. I don't find it quite as satisfying. I've given up reading tasting notes, actually. I find them generally it's not something I want to read. If I can summarize, Agnes, the wine world as it is, as we have it at the moment, relies enormously heavily on tasting notes. You open any wine magazine, it's full of tasting notes. You read reviews, it's nothing but tasting notes. I personally think we've got to a kind of decadent point where tasting notes have taken over to a far too important an extent, and we need to find other ways of talking about wine and nuancing wine and differentiating wine, which is really a bit more interesting than just endless tasting notes, which I think are very boring and I think puts people off wine, actually. The Wine Advocate, all Vinous, Jancis Robinson, they're all offering 30,000 tasting notes, 40,000 tasting notes, whatever the sum is. What do we do with that? how does that help us live our lives? First of all, most of those wines are not obtainable. Secondly, we don't have room in the cellar for all those wines. Thirdly, we don't have the money for all of those wines. It's all completely irrelevant to my experience as a wine drinker. So I would much rather that people talked about wine in a sort of different way, a more imaginative way, a way that would draw people in more, a way that would help people explore for themselves more, and not always have this de haut en bas from high to low, me telling you exactly what I think about all of these 300 wines, all in their scored order, all the rest. It stinks to me. I've had enough of that. I just want to discover wine in a different way.
I really like what you said about describing wine as people. I sometimes do that when I don't have like any way, or nothing else comes to my mind. Just sometimes wine acts as a person.
Yeah, and we think about wine as people. Some are very loud and noisy, and we're not always in the mood for that. Others are super quiet. You have to be ready to listen.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of potential analogies there. I just think we could be much more imaginative about it than we are.
That's true, definitely. But now let's put aside the tastings and the vocabulary. I read your book, and I particularly maybe attached to one specific essay, which was the way, the name of the essay was the way the book is named.
Drinking with the Valkyries, yeah.
Yeah, Drinking with the Valkyries. And you were talking about vintage port there.
Yeah.
And, when you open any kind of wine book about the traditional one, and when you read what should be done with the vintage port, they also age it, open it after 100 years, and maybe not even then. And here you go completely the other way. Yeah. So I don't want to spoil that because I particularly like that essay, so I will not talk about a bit more. But I wanted to ask you about these drinking windows that, again, sometimes some of these wine magazines and wine critics kind of also suggest. What do you think about? Is it something that maybe nowadays is irrelevant?
Yeah, well,
could I dare?
It's something I pay very little attention to myself. As with food and wine recommendations, which is something, again, that I pay very little attention to myself. I just like exploring and discovering. There's another essay in the book, actually, called In Praise of Young Wines, I think it is, anyway, something like that. I'm a great believer in wines when they're young, often being their most beautiful. Okay, I mean, not when you just buy it off the shelf, or not when it's just been bottled. Wines need a few months to calm down. But I think almost all wines actually are really better when they're young than when they're matured and older. There are a few categories that we know by dint of experience that will be better when they're older, but they're really in a minority. And most wines actually are really better when they're young, when they're fleshy, when they have their energy, when they have most to say. Okay, sometimes it's a bit chaotic. And I'm a great believer, for example, in starting a bottle on day 1 and finishing it on day 2 or even day 3, because you can see changes during that time. Sort of mini aging process happens. But definitely don't think that any expensive wine has to be aged, or any great wine has to be aged, or any serious wine has to be aged, or even any wine has to be aged. I mean, there are plenty of people who, if you give them a bottle of wine, they'll say, "Oh well, fantastic," I'll put that away.
Yeah.
And they put it away in somewhere where the storage is no good, and it wasn't meant to be aged anyway. And when they come to drink it, it's a really disappointing experience. So I would say there's a lot to be said for drinking wines when they're young and beautiful and fleshy and exciting.
Is it safe to assume that you really enjoy the fruit in wine?
Yes, absolutely. But, it could be texture as well. It could be energy, however we choose to describe that. It just lots of things, but when wine is young, it's when all of those things are at their most vivid and exuberant, and I do enjoy vividness and exuberance in wine for sure.
May I ask you, what would be those few or specific wines that you say, well, this wine requires aging and I will open it a bit later?
Okay, well, first and foremost, it would be Bordeaux.
Okay.
Good Bordeaux. Actually, even, I can't afford expensive Bordeaux. Yeah. Class growths, all the rest, they're beyond my budget now. But I do always in 22, I have bought some Lalande de Pomerol, for example. I have bought some Cru Bourgeois from Saint-Estèphe and so on. I'm sure they will be very good. I will certainly try them when they first arrive. But I do know from experience that, wow, that wine does something really exciting as it ages, more so than any other wine, in my opinion. And actually, the longer you can age it, if you have good storage conditions, which I don't, the better. For example, last night with my eldest son, we tried a little Pessac Léognan that I bought in half bottles from 2010. Not a famous wine at all. Not even that good a wine. And I thought, oh yeah, we've drunk most of those. Let's just try that half bottle. And actually, it's 2010's a nice vintage. It was still only halfway to where it's going to get to, with even more time. So the greatest example I can think of wine that really does age well is Bordeaux, red Bordeaux. I know from my friends who are great Burgundy lovers who can afford great Burgundy, that can also do it. Personally, I've not had as much success with aging Burgundy as my friends who are specialists have, but I take their word for it. After that, I'm not sure there is, a lot of wine out there. I mean, I don't particularly like aged champagne. I sort of prefer it when it still has a few bubbles.
Yeah.
And then great Italian wines, people don't understand this, but the processes that Italians give to their wine before they bottle it in the great regions like Barolo, Barbaresco, Tuscany, Chianti, Brunello di Montalcino, those wines go into bottle because of what the way in which the grower has looked after it before it goes into bottle. They go into bottle semi-mature. Now, I know that connoisseurs of those wines will say, yes, a great vintage, you should age for another 10 or 15 or 20 years. Yeah, maybe they're right, but when I find when I buy those wines that, even if I try them fairly soon afterwards, I get a lot of pleasure from them. And to me, they come across as semi-mature wines, actually, because what the producers have done to them before they bottle them. French wine is different because the great French regions, they tend to bottle them a little bit earlier. And then Napa, we could talk about as well. Great Napa red wine does age magnificently. I don't have many examples. I haven't been able to taste many examples, but just from the few I have tasted, that is another category of wine where its aging potential is very, very good. But one of the great things about Napa is that it's so welcoming so early too.
Exactly.
So if you like it when it's so welcoming when it's young, you don't have to wait.
Yeah.
It's not forbidding in any sense. It's got its arms open. It's saying, come in and enjoy.
It is very welcoming.
Yeah. But I know from a few precious experiences that they can age very, very well as well. And they also age much, much longer than you'd think for a wine that ripe to begin with.
Yeah. So what are other wine myths that you would like to debunk, I don't know, or throw them out of there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the biggest one of all would be, and I think because scores and tasting notes have taken over the way in which people buy wine and appreciate wine to this dangerous plague extent, it would be the notion that excellence matters more than difference. It doesn't. I'm not even sure excellence truly exists, because I said to you right at the start of our discussion, we divide wine objectively into good and very good. Very good is still a big category. You have to use your subjectivity at that point. So, the whole system begins to fall to bits of pinning a score to a wine. I mean, what does that mean? Pinning a 97-point score rather than a 94-point wine. What does that mean? I might feel like a completely different category of wine where nothing ever gets more than 89 points that evening or whatever. So to me, the whole sort of quest for excellence is a slightly insane quest, which it's driving us mad, and we've let it drive us mad, and it's gone too far, and it's time we turned our attention back to difference, which is really the joy and the joy of wine. That's what most people like about wine. It's what even most wine people like about wine. But we have no way of scoring for difference. You can't score a wine for difference. You just have to go to something different. So to me, the whole scores thing has completely screwed up our brains. and we're now become totally distracted with this excellence and scores and all this shit.
Mm-hmm. And
honestly, it's difference that matters, and those things aren't articulated in that way. So if I could destroy one sacred god or myth or whatever, it would be that one.
All right, great. I think, from all of the wine myths, I would not even consider this. So, wow. So if we now kind of move away from that, and maybe I will ask you rather personal question, and you feel free if you want to answer or something, that's completely fine as well. But you have, I think, such a beautiful wine career, and you have written, you said 12, 13 books.
Yeah, but only about, only really 4 proper books. Well, 3 proper books. There are 3 I'm really proud of.
All right.
Which would be The New France,
okay,
Whiskey Island, about the island of Islay, both the whiskey and the place, and then the Valkyries book.
Okay, whiskey. I did not know about that though. So I wanted to ask you, is there something that you regret in your wine career? Is it some wine that you didn't buy, or I don't know, but just...
I can the one thing I regret is being such an appallingly bad business person. I've made very little money out of this career. It sounds sort of spoiled and ridiculous to say it, because all the people watching are thinking, hey, this guy, what a dude, he's cruised around the wine world all his working life, drinking great wines. What is there to complain about? And it's quite true. There is nothing to complain about at all, except that, it's actually been very, very hard work. And, I would love to have written more books, for example, but more serious books, but I just haven't been able to, because they don't make any money. I have a family of 4. I need to make money. And a lot of the ways in which you make money actually in the wine world are sort of drudgery. They're not very interesting things, but they're just things you have to do to make money. So my one regret is being actually as unsuccessful as I've been in a business sense. Many wine writers have been enormously successful in a business sense. I've been a catastrophic failure in a business sense. So in a way, that's perhaps what I regret, because I could have written more decent books if I'd somehow managed my career better and made a bit more money out of it. Anyway, that's what happened. That's life.
But I think that's something you can still change, no?
Well, I'm 67. I'm running out of a bit of time. And actually, my sons, they're 15 and 17. They still need a lot of money for the next few years. So I'm not sure, actually, it is going to change much. But anyway, as I say, that's the way it's turned out. And I have a lot to be grateful for, of course.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. And probably one last question. So, and that's going to be also maybe rather personal, but towards me. So I kind of wish to continue around now. I understand that my career will also be in wine. So I wish to continue here with this world, which I really, truly love. So maybe you have some advice to me. I don't know, business is fun and yeah, something.
Yeah.
But still.
Well, I think the most important thing when it comes to a wine career is that you decide what it is you most like about wine and what you feel you have most to offer to the wine world, because the wine world gives us a lot. We have to give back to it also. That's very important. We have to change it. It faces many challenges in the future, notably climate change. There's lots of things that we need to help the wine world with. So you need to decide how you would most enjoy doing that. In other words, some people want to go off and make wine. Some people want to do what I do, and which is write about it and educate about it and all the rest. But there's also the very important part of wine trading. That's enormously important. There are all these people, in Latvia who want to drink good wine, and the wine is over there in Italy or France or California or Australia or New Zealand or wherever. It needs intermediaries to bring it home. So there are many different roles you can take in the wine world. I think it's important that you know yourself what you would most like to do in that world, what you feel you can most contribute. And I think if you do that, you'll have a very happy and fulfilling career in wine, and hopefully make a bit of money too.
Yeah, that would be nice, of course. Yeah, Yeah, because wine is getting more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is another. I mean, there are so many things we could have talked about. The price of wine, and particularly fine wine, is a serious issue, because it means that, you know, the wine world we grew up in, where, you know, you saved up for a lovely bottle and, you know, more or less anything was accessible to you, is no longer true, because wine at that top level has become a division of luxury goods.
Yes.
And so some different rules apply. And I think it's a terrible shame. I think it's going to impoverish the wine world, paradoxically. It'll bring it wealth, but it will also impoverish it. And I think that's a big challenge for the future. So yeah, that's an issue to confront.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
Oh my God, I loved it. I'm sorry if I was not maybe...
You were perfect.
But what I want to say, like, I brought not a very fancy wine, and I know your luggage got lost somewhere in Toronto. But I hope, at least if you cannot bring it with you, then maybe you can enjoy it here. It is one very dear producer to me as well. It is nothing fancy. It's just a beautiful wine that I enjoy myself a lot. So I hope you will also.
Well, lovely. So can I take it out of the bag?
Sure.
Yeah, let's see what it is. Ah, François Chidin. Fantastic. From the Loire, Montlouis. Beautiful bottle. I will drink this with my Latvian friends with great pleasure.
I hope you will enjoy it.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah. And I don't know. Do you wear something like that? Or maybe your kids whenever you're vineyards? Like that's also, from the...
That's your logo.
That's our logo.
I'll be proud to wear that. Let's put it on. There we go.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. I really
You're welcome.
appreciate it. This has been
my
lovely.
pleasure.